So here we go here, and we'll figure it out. Okay, we talked yesterday before the fire drill that the United States declared war and raised an army. We mentioned that during the winter of 1916-1917, that all American hopes of remaining neutral really vanished. We had such continued stress and poor relations with Germany that war was simply inevitable. It was going to happen. And so finally, on April 6th of 1917, the United States officially declared war on Germany. And I mentioned that the Allies in Europe were in pretty bad shape at this time, and their goal was simply to hang on until the United States could get there and bail them out, because they were about at the brink of losing the war. Now, we mentioned that President Wilson had two options to consider to assemble fighting men for this war. He could ask for volunteers, which Abraham Lincoln did prior to the Civil War, or he could establish for the first time the draft. On May 7th, 1917, he signed a bill to enact the draft, and it set the minimum age to be drafted at 21. And I mentioned to you how the draft works. Is basically, it's like a lottery. You have ping pong balls with each 365 balls having a date on it, and whichever ball is drawn first, that person has a draft number 1, whichever draft is second, 2, etc., until they decide how far they're going to draft down. And so he initiated the draft. We also mentioned, as far as statistical figures, by June 5th of 1917, nearly 10 million men had registered for the draft, and by November of 1918, the American military had 5 million men under arms. We also said that Wilson was going to have a little bit of thought process on getting public support within the United States to go to war. He needed a PR campaign, so he created a committee on public information. He appointed George Creel to chair that committee. And I think that's kind of where we ended to a point. Okay? Now, the Committee on Public Information did two things to help the war effort. Two things. And I think I mentioned this just before the bell rang yesterday, and that was the sale of Liberty bonds to finance the war. Liberty bonds. I think you call them savings bonds today. But they were Liberty bonds. And I'll tell you how they worked. They borrowed money from the American people to finance the war. So what they would do is they'd say, Taylor, we really need some money to finance the war. If you buy a $50 Liberty bond, in 7 years we'll give you $75 back for it. That's kind of how it worked. And you can still do that. That's an exaggeration on the interest rates. But that's what they did. You could buy a bond for like 25, at the time I believe you could buy it for half. If you bought it for half, if you bought a $50 bond, you paid $25 for it. In a period of 6 or 7 or 8 years, you could cash that in for twice as much. That's what they did, figuring that they needed the money now and could repay later with pretty high interest. You can still go down and buy savings bonds now in the same philosophy. I don't know exactly what it is, but I'll have to ask old Gil McHenry next time I see him. But I think it's the same thing. I think you go buy a $100 savings bond for a certain price, and then after a certain period of time, which has the date on the bond, then it's worth that much more. It's like interest, okay? So that's one thing they did, and a lot of people took advantage of that. Would you take advantage of that if you had a little extra cash? Would you go buy some Liberty bonds knowing you were going to double your profits on that in a period of time after the war? A lot of people did. So that was a big deal. That was really something that really initiated some money. The second thing they did is the Committee on Public Information raised morale for the war effort. Okay? Raised morale. What does that mean when you raise somebody's morale? We're trying to raise your morale in here by, planning this trip and taking you to D.C., and you'll feel really good about yourself in this class. Your morale will be high. I talk about self-esteem all the time, how important that is. Well, when they raised morale to get people into this war, supporting the United States, it created an anti-German attitude in the country. So in creating that great morale in favor of the war, an anti-German attitude happened across the United States. And I'll give you 3 examples of that. Kind of silly, but kind of interesting. 3 examples of the anti-German attitude across the United States during World War I. Now, Mr. Tonkovich would be very upset about this, because public schools across the country banned the teaching of the German language. They banned the teaching of the German language. We no longer teach German in public schools, because that showed an anti-German attitude. So no more German in public schools. Now, does anybody know the origin of sauerkraut? Where did how many like sauerkraut? It's awesome. Yeah, it's really good. On your hot dogs?
No, when you put it on pizza.
Pizza, yeah, sauerkraut, great. Where's it come? Where's the origin of that? Germany. Germany. So they began to refer to sauerkraut as liberty cabbage. People didn't say sauerkraut. I'm going to put liberty cabbage. Yeah. Sauerkraut is S-A-U-E-R-K-R-A-U-T. S-A-U-E-R-K-R-A-U-T. Sauerkraut became known as liberty cabbage. That's what people call it. What do you think they called the German measles, Woofington? Come on, piggyback on what I'm telling you. They called the German measles liberty measles. Called the German measles liberty measles. So, no more German in teaching of public schools. Sauerkraut became known as liberty cabbage, and if you caught the German measles, they were referred to as the liberty measles.
I don't know why they stick with calling them German measles.
They're bad. Yeah, I don't know. That's what they did. So, that takes us to our next subtopic then, Ms. King. That takes us to our next subtopic then, which is the United States in World War I, also known in history as the Great War. The United States in World War I, or the Great War. Now, I told you that the Allies were in kind of bad shape before we got involved, and before the United States entered World War I, German submarines were just starving Great Britain right out of the war. They were just starving them right out of the war. And how'd they do that? How'd these German submarines starve Britain out of the war? Yeah, they sank 660,000 tons of shipping that was either coming from or going to Great Britain by the end of March 1917. So by the end of March 1917, German U-boats had sank 660,000 tons of shipping that was either coming from or going to Great Britain. In other words, the British weren't getting any food, weren't getting any supplies, because these German U-boats were sinking anything going in or out.
By what date?
By March of 1917. That's a lot. 660,000 tons of shipping by the end of March 1917.
60 or 16?
660,000 tons of shipping. 60 tons. 660,000 tons of shipping by the end of March 1917. Now that increased. So by the end of March, again, because we're having a little trouble here, German U-boats sank 660,000 tons of shipping. By the beginning of April 1917, it went to 900,000 tons. By the beginning of April 1917, the total increased to 900,000 tons of shipping that was sunk, either coming or going to Great Britain. By that same time, 25% of the British fleet lay at the bottom of the ocean. In other words, U-boats had sunk 25% of the British Navy by the beginning of April 1917. Now this is quite a statistic here. By April of 1917, Britain had only enough food reserves to feed its population for 3 more weeks. That was it. So, again, U-boats are making a big impact on starving Great Britain out of the war, sinking tons and tons and tons of shipping that is either coming from or going to Great Britain. from 660,000 tons to 900,000 tons. 25% of the British Navy's at the bottom of the ocean, and by April 1917, Great Britain only has enough food reserves in the country to feed its population for 3 more weeks. Yeah.
So is Great Britain still considered like the greatest navy in the world at this point?
Not really, no. Germany has really kind of taken over this deal. Now, it wasn't until May of 1917 that the United States helped in any way to turn the tide in Great Britain. So in May of 1917 is when the United States stepped in and tried to help turn the tide in Great Britain. Now, what are we doing? Are we just jumping into this war and starting to fight? What do we still have to do? We already got them, but what do we got to do to them? Train them. You just aren't going to send them over there. As much as the Allies would like us just to put them on the boats the next day and send them over, we'll talk about that. That's not possible. So how is the United States going to help turn the tide in Great Britain before we can get fighting men on the ground? What do you think, Manir? What's the problem here? What are German U-boats doing? Sinking those ships. So the only thing we can really do, I think, before we get our men trained to fight is to try to protect what? Those ships that are going to Great Britain so they don't get sunk. So what happened is American Admiral William Sims insisted that American vessels travel in convoys. Okay, so instead of sending those American vessels over to bring supplies to Great Britain, which are badly needed, instead of sending those ships individually, he's going to send them in convoys. And what would be guarding these ships that are going over with all this food for the British? What's going to be guarding them? No, not our U-boats, because we're not really that great at them yet. Our American destroyers, battleships. So these convoys of American ships that will be taking food and supplies to the British are going to be guarded by American destroyers that are designed for anti-submarine warfare. Okay, so they're designed now for anti-submarine warfare. So it's Admiral William Sims that's saying, hey, listen, the only way we're going to get any supplies over the British before we get our troops trained is to go in convoys and have these American ships protected by American battleships that are designed for anti-submarine warfare. So, by July of 1917, the United States were able to send supplies and food to Great Britain guarded by 34 destroyers. So because of Admiral Sims' convoy strategy, we are going to keep Britain afloat until we can get our troops trained. Now, they also, just as once we get our troops trained, what do we got to do to get them over there? Ship them. So he's going to use the same convoy strategy to ship American soldiers over to the war front, because that would be convenient to, have submarines blow up the ships and not get the men there. And with his strategy, not one American soldier that was shipped to Europe was killed during transport. Not one. So he had a very good plan here. So, while Admiral Sims is getting Britain under control and trying to get them fed before we can get there so they don't starve them out, Wilson's got to choose someone to lead overall American forces in World War I. And he chooses General John J. Pershing. General John J. Pershing. When you go to Washington, D.C., you'll see a nice statue of him pretty close to the White House. General John J. Pershing. And he will be the man that will lead American forces in World War I. So President Wilson chooses General John J. Pershing to lead American forces in World War I. And Pershing's troops will become known as the American Expeditionary Force. That's the name of Pershing's troops. American troops in World War I will be the American Expeditionary Force. Now, this is kind of interesting because I kind of alluded to this. General Pershing had European leaders just frustrated. Why? Kind of alluded to it earlier. Why were they so frustrated with it, European leaders? Come on now. Because he's taken, in their opinion, too long to get there. But Pershing was not going to send troops over there that were not prepared. So European leaders that wanted military help from the United States immediately were very frustrated with General Pershing, but he insisted that American troops were going to go through proper training before they were going to be shipped over to Europe to fight. So we entered the war when? When did we declare war? Somebody look that up in their notes. When did we declare war? What was the date?
April 6th.
1917. We didn't, the first American troop didn't arrive much before March of 1918. So how long did it take us to get him trained? Almost a year. But he wasn't going to send them over there untrained. We hadn't fought in a war for how long? You know, Spanish-American War, but it was like, you know, a summer long. Yeah. You know, yeah, been a long, long time. So we didn't have guys, a large number of troops ready to go. So the bulk of American troops didn't even get to Europe till March of 1918. Okay, that'll take us to World War I on the Western Front. World War I on the Western Front, which is self-explanatory. It's the Western Front of Europe. That's where we're fighting. Western Front of Europe. Now, what do you think the German strategy was right now? As soon as the Americans declared war on Germany, what became the German strategy in World War I? What do you think, pal? Think about it. Come on now, these are AP kids. What would be their strategy? Number one strategy, only strategy they had. Close. Before that even, though. But they were going to try and do something before the Americans ever got there, and that was win. Yeah, their number one strategy was to win the war in Europe before the United States got there. Because they knew once the United States got there, it was going to be a lot more difficult. So as soon as the United States declares war on Germany, in April of 1917, the German strategy changed to try to win the war in Europe before the United States could send any troops there at all. So in 1918, there were two incredibly important battles in France that were fought before the Americans ever got there. And if the French couldn't hang on in these two battles, it wouldn't have mattered if the United States got there or not. So in 1918, there were two very important battles that were fought in France before American troops ever arrived. And if this goes south for France, the Allies are sunk and the war will be over before Americans ever get there. The first battle occurred on March 21st, 1918. March 21st, 1918. It was the Battle of the Somme River. Battle of the Somme River in France. Again, a battle fought before the United States got there. March 21st, 1918, the Battle of the Somme River. The second battle occurred on April 9th, 1918, the Battle of the Lys River. The Battle of the Lys River. So the two battles that were fought in France before we ever got there, the United States, occurred on March 21st, 1918, the Battle of the Somme River, and April 9th, 1918, the Battle of the Lys River. What is the French or Allied goal in these two battles? Hang on, which means you don't have to win, you just have to not lose. Both battles resulted in a stalemate where the French were able to hang on and not lose. They wouldn't call it a complete victory by any stretch, but it wasn't a complete loss. So that was the historians considered it a stalemate. And this stalemate at the Battle of the Somme River and the Battle of the Lys River gave extra time for American troops to arrive with support. Without these stalemates on the part of the French, we are looking at a whole different history here. Okay, the first battle fought by American soldiers was also in France, and it was the Battle of Chateau, Thierry. The Battle of Chateau, Thierry. That was the first battle in World War I, which also occurred in France, in which American troops participated. And that battle was fought just 50 miles from Paris, France. Big battle. So the first battle fought by American soldiers was the Battle of Chateau, Thierry. The battle was fought just 50 miles from Paris, France. Now in this battle, the Allies were under the leadership of French Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch. Ferdinand Foch. The Allies were under the leadership of French Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch. And although there were American soldiers fighting in that battle, the French Field Marshal was in charge. And he did a great job, and they forced the German army completely away from Paris and back across the Marne River, which separated what? France and Allies from Central Power territory, right. So the Allies, under the leadership of French Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch, forced the German army out of Paris and back